Mima Basharnitsan, the founder and CEO of Dialogue. Welcome to 10 by 20, a series of 10 questions discussed in 20-minute dialogues with local and international leaders doing visionary work at the intersection of people, technology, and society. Welcome back to 10 by 20. Today's guest is Ari Wallach, an applied futurist and founder and executive director of Longpath Labs, an initiative focused on bringing long-term thinking and coordinated behavior to individual, organizational, and societal realms in order to ensure humanity flourishes on an ecologically thriving planet Earth for centuries to come. Ari is also the author of the recently published Longpath, Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs. Welcome, Ari.
Thanks for having me.
Hello.
Hello.
So we always kick these off with a look into the past. I know we're going to talk about the future, but we're looking into the past for just a second. I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit about your background, how you grew up and where you grew up and what did it all mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's kind of where you start the questions, but it's actually where I start the book also, very much in the past, which is kind of throws people off. You know, this futurist starts the book in the past. So I was born in Mexico. You know, okay, why was he born in Mexico? My father was born in the 1920s in Poland, and very early on, as a teenager, World War II started. A bunch of terrible things happened. He joined the Jewish underground, the partisans, and he fought against the Germans for 3 years. Was a Nazi hunter after the war. Made his way from Cuba to Mexico, where he met my mom, who was an artist, but also studied under Buckminster Fuller. And so why that's highly relevant to this book is because I grew up in a home where every kind of dinner conversation always spanned like 100 and 150 years. So we went back 50 to 75 years because my father was very much kind of focused on history and how we got to this point, almost as a way of kind of sometimes for warning signals, if you will. And then my mom would always kind of take everything forward because she studied under the acclaimed futurist Buckminster Fuller. And so Longpath is very much an attempt to kind of take the way I was raised and a bunch of other things and use it to allow us to kind of critically examine how we got to this point in human history, what that point is, and how we move forward. So my background is through and throughout this book.
That's awesome. But before you wrote the book, you had this, you've been doing Longpath Labs for quite a while, right? And then you've had other things that you've been thinking about from a work perspective, and probably even just before all of that happened, you've been, your father, your husband, you've got like all these things that are on your plate. Can you tell me a little bit about just there's the future part of how you grew up, but then there's also the relationships you had with your parents and others in your community. How did those influence some of the work that you've been doing, or just in your life in general?
Yeah, life in general. Look, I grew up in the I was born in Mexico, but mostly grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in a home that was always full of people, right? My parents were always having parties. It was very kind of social. And so I very much view life through a relational lens. So I do a lot of the inner work that, for those in San Francisco listening and or watching, I spent a lot of time, because I went to UC Berkeley, I spent a lot of time at the San Francisco Zen Center and at Green Gulch, kind of going through the rungs of Soto Zen and kind of doing a lot of that inner work. At the same time, we're very social family. So there's always been this dynamic where I had kind of this internal work that I was doing, but also very much wanted to always be in relation, right? I lived in a 55-person vegetarian co-op, basically commune at UC Berkeley. That I loved that. I loved eating with 55 people, vegetarian meals, 7 nights a week. I also loved on the weekends going off to Green Gulch and sitting for multiple sessions and doing that work. You find in the book and in the work that I do now, always this kind of Mobius strip between that kind of the internal and the external. And for folks who know me and basically actually what I just told you, like that's how this book came about. That's kind of who I am. I'm always, and for, we were talking about this before we started recording, like I always kind of lived this like falsely bifurcated life, right? So I would be very social, and I started this thing called Inform at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. So I get up and speak in front of 1,000 people, and it's very, very public facing. But on the weekends, I would like run off to Green Gulch, right? Or I'd run off to like a Krishnamurti retreat or something, or Esalen. And it wasn't until a few years ago, really kind of probably 2015, where I realized like what I was doing, it was a false bifurcation, and both for myself and for the folks that I work with and the stuff that I was working on, mostly around kind of climate change, climate refugees, a lot of work with the UN, that if we were going to move forward as individuals and as a society, we're going to have to marry these two things, right? This kind of inner realm that so much of us are kind of wrestling with, and self-actualization and really self-awareness has to be part and parcel of a kind of larger movement towards better tomorrows. And so the book is really kind of a manifestation of both where I came from, but also how I've been thinking about it over the past couple of years.
Yeah. Well, I can't agree more, especially with that whole, the Mobius strip is so similar to how I live. Although I feel like before COVID, that Mobius strip was really one-sided for me.
Yep.
In terms of work, or social. And now I've got like a really great balance of like, I hide and then I appear, and then I hide and then I appear.
Yeah.
And also similarly focused on like inner work. But also something I noticed, I was in Venice for the Biennale a couple weeks ago. And there was a like an exhibition at the Prada Foundation. She's got like a bunch of different foundations in Italy, of her collection and other kind of exhibitions about the human brain. And there were, I think it started at like the 10th or 12th century and onwards to current time in terms of how the brain was studied and how neuroscience became what it is now. And the most interesting thing that I took away with it, obviously the science is fascinating and how they used to do surgeries is fascinating. But the piece that was like, I was like, oh, this is so interesting, is like, they've always talked about mind, body, and soul. The scientists were talking about this, and how interesting that now we're coming back to it after being so separated. And like, now it was like just the mind for so long. The body was something else, right? That held up the brain. And now, anyway, so I just feel like we're hopefully as a society and at large going towards in the direction of where we're finally recognizing that it's a trifecta, not like.
Well, the trifecta, it's more, I mean, it's kind of reintegrating, right? So I talk a lot about in the book about where what you're talking about kind of came from, this kind of the Renaissance through Enlightenment, through, mass industrialization and current kind of third wave capitalism was all about this kind of alienation from nature, right? So whereas the Romantics would go into the forest and see the forest as a system, we now go into a forest and say, oh, there's $32 million of lumber here to be extricated and used into a home, right? I'm overstating that, but that's kind of where we are as a society. And so the question is, how do we combine both of those now, right? Like, we need wood to build homes or we need something to build homes, and we want to think about and be real about that. At the same time, we want to take much more of an integrated systems approach. And so I think this what I call in the book, this intertidal moment that we're in, this kind of in between, is part of that in between is recognizing that false, what I said binary, but false trifectinary. I'll make up that word. And seeing it as that, and we're seeing those things kind of recombine. And again, it's no longer just like on the weekend you're this, and on 5 days a week you're this, but literally, and I think COVID helped accelerate this, people are now saying like, how do I combine my values, my morals, my need to pay my 30-year mortgage, and how to become a better human, or as I state, a great ancestor all together. Right. And so we see this in media. We see this in all sorts of really interesting places where it used to be like you went here for a business magazine and you went to this magazine for your self-actualization work. And now you're seeing those coming together. And we're not totally there yet, but you can see it in a lot of different kind of, unevenly distributed futures that are popping up all over the world. And I know you're part of it. I'm part of it. And the question is then, how do we actually scale that to folks who are still, because it's a very privileged conversation, who are still struggling like day to day, hour to hour. And I think that's a big part of the work that we have ahead of us in the next, 5 to 50 probably years.
Totally. So if you were to sum up like top 3 questions that are you're most interested in right now, just as a person in general, not as an author necessarily, not as just like as a person, what are they? What are you thinking about?
Well, as a person and as a father, right? So I'm going to throw that in there because, and I think this is a kind of a perennial question, but for those of us who are parents who've kind of gone through a lot, the question I'm wrestling with is like, how much leeway do you give your children to kind of fail? Because through that dynamic process, they become better people because they have to struggle, right? And so much of parenting right now is either helicopter parenting or snow plowing. We're getting anything out of the way. So I'm kind of wrestling with that question. The second question connected to the first is, how do we kind of reconcile this, again, another split between what we're learning about evolutionary biology and neuroscience and about humans and about these very advanced hardware systems called Homo sapiens, and the need to connect to something of, for lack of better terminology, like the divine or the more spiritual. And how do we reconcile those two things? So we're talking over the internet right now, which is amazing. And at the same time, like, I know we're about to enter into the, the Jewish high holidays, right? Where I put on another hat and I'm in a completely different space. And how do we reconcile and kind of bring those again into a proper balance so that we're thinking about becoming the best versions of ourselves as individuals? And and this is the third question, how do we reconcile becoming the best version of ourselves as individuals while at the same time doing that in relation with the other humans around us, both in the present and the other humans, future generations to come? So those are the three things I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. You said that you used to go between these two things, like Zen Center to actively like social and so forth. I don't know how true that is for you now, obviously having kids and a little bit of a different lifestyle in where you live in New York. But when do you find that you're most creative? Or where?
Well, it's where and when. And it's actually, it's like very, very simple. And I'm sure 98% of your folks have said this. When I am like in deep nature, right? And ideally, but not alone, but like in deep nature with good friends, wrestling with these kind of existential questions, right? That's always, because that's when I'm the most free, right? Like, I think we don't stop. I love the city. I live, in New York City, but like we are hyperly overstimulated between our phones and the kind of general mental environment and the news and the media. And I find that like literally at a neuro level, that I am more able to kind of access different pockets of ideas and ways of thinking when I am outside of kind of overt man-made reality and on like hiking and like in nature. And I would say the next level down would be swimming in that same setting. So to be hyper specific, we go to Cape Cod during the summer for several weeks, and there's these amazing giant freshwater ponds, which is necessary because the rest of the ocean water around us is covered in, full of great white sharks. And so being able to go on these like half-mile freshwater swims, not worrying about the person in the lane next to me, or if am I going to hit a wall, or, or when does the swim team show up, where you're just going further than you think you can go. At first I'm like, wow, this is a really long swim when I do this daily, but eventually you are very much in the flow state, literally, technically, and that's, when I find I'm like 10, 15 minutes into a thought, but I've covered a lot of distance. So that's when I know I'm in the right space.
Awesome. So what are you seeing shift as like just the result of your work over the years? I mean, obviously I feel like there's quite a bit that you've done with different companies and different clients that you've worked on with over the years, but is there something that stands out for you that you're like, wow, we did that?
Well, I mean, look, we did a lot of work with the UN Refugee Agency and helping them kind of think about obviously forced human migration, people who are forced to flee, but starting to think about human migration in general and what that looks like over the next 100 years. So moving from this kind of Westphalian nation state way of thinking about human migration, like people going up against closed borders, which is still very much a reality, don't get me wrong, but starting to kind of think about how as a species on planet Earth, hundreds of millions, if not billions of folks will start to be on the move. And how do we prepare people, not in a political or bureaucratic way, but almost at a psychological, emotional way, to start moving to areas of better resource, right? And this isn't just people coming from like the global south to the global north, the way it's often talked about in the media. It's also internally, right? Like there may be coming a point, and this is where like real estate people will go after me, but when we think about Southern California or the Southwest, that a lot of those folks will be moving up to the Midwest, right? And so what I guess I'm proud of is like starting that conversation. And so that's the way to kind of answer that question. I went detailed first without going meta. Let me go back up to the meta. It's starting conversations that are difficult, right? Back when I was at UC Berkeley, I was the head of conflict resolution for the co-op system for all the kind of the student housing off campus. So I carried a little pager in the late 90s, and I get a page from house managers, and I'd show up. And what I found more often than not there were conflicts that were occurring between two different parties, But the way to kind of transform those conflicts was to start having conversations about, deeper values, deeper needs, and also a deeper sense of shared destiny and futures. And so I think a lot of the conversations that are coming out of the book and that I'm having kind of around the world, pre-book and current book, is about how do we get folks to become more open to kind of thinking about not just their desired futures, but what I call examined desired futures, like really critically thinking about how it is they got to wanting those futures, and are those the actual ones they are truly desirous of, right? When I was at Berkeley, I studied the Frankfurt School, which is like the originator of critical theory. And so that training helped me kind of get to that point. And specifically, I studied I met him, but really the work of Jürgen Habermas on kind of discourse ethics and the ethics of how we talk. And so kind of combining all of these is what you see in the book.
Yeah, that's awesome. So much lost, I feel like, that in the current, like our current culture, where we don't go deep enough to look at like how things became what they became.
Yeah.
My biggest frustration is like in many conversations, especially with the younger generations, I find that like I'm like the it's fine to be the voice of wisdom, but why am I also the contextual, like historical person too?
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like that like in terms of being a good ancestor, I feel like the younger generations, I'd love for them to like own that a little bit more. Maybe I'm not old enough yet.
I get a lot of parents being like, oh, my kid's going off to college. What should they study so they can become future proof? I'm like, oh, that's easy. History. Right. Like, I don't care what the other major is, but if you're not going to double major and one of those being history, at least you should minor in it. Right. Yeah. It's amazing how many folks I see coming out of computer science programs, kind of anything within STEM or nano or kind of industries of the future, but who have no historical understanding of where we've been as a species over, let's say, the past several hundred years, but really the past, 5 to 20,000 years. Like if you don't understand like this movement from, hunter-gatherer to agricultural and what that did, right? I mean, that's where God is created, right? This whole history of God as an idea, and hunter-gatherer, we were so much more connected and in vibe with nature. But as the agricultural revolution comes about and we're kind of forced into buildings and cities with walls, we need an omnipotent thing to make sure we don't shirk our ethical duties. Because in the tribe, if Ari did something bad, I was kicked out of the cave. But in the city behind closed doors, I can do it. But now we have to invent something. We invent this all-seeing God. And now we have the all-seeing surveillance state. So no wonder. So like, but knowing the history of that, and our desires for that and kind of the ethical containers that we have to create, then you can start having conversations about surveillance capitalism. But if you don't understand the kind of deeper roots of that, hermeneutics of that, it becomes like diatribes and monologues and polemics, and you need to understand that. So I'm glad I know what it's like to be the old man voice of reason. I don't feel like that, but that's where we are now.
I know. Crazy. Every year that goes by, I'm like, really? Is that me now?
Yeah.
So you ready for some rapid fire?
Yes.
Okay. So when do you feel most connected to others?
In a body of water.
Cool.
And the other, I know it's rapid fire, but I'm thinking about my family. Like when we're in an ocean, lake, pond, or pool together, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the conductivity of the water, but that's when I feel the individuals kind of melt away and we become something bigger than ourselves.
That's beautiful. It's also beautiful that you noticed that. That's another part that I think is really important. When and where are you happiest? In a body of water.
Body of my family. If I was gonna say kind of where it is continually, I would say, again, with family and friends, specifically every Friday night, we do Shabbat, even though we're not religious. I keep bringing up God, but like every Friday night, we do Shabbat dinner. We light the candles. We do the challah. We do a little singing. We have these very long meals that talk about the week that we had and the week to come. And that's when I feel most there.
Wow, that's beautiful. Ritual, right?
Yeah, everything.
What intersection of disciplines, this is going to be interesting, are you currently most fascinated by? Just one.
Well, it's an intersection, so it can't just be one, right?
Well, an intersection, right? But yeah, no, I'm kidding. However you want to answer it.
I think it's a theme, right? It's neuroscience and spirituality.
I love that. Me too, actually. What's your greatest regret?
So I try not.
Jewish person, your greatest regret.
Well, I didn't go to medical school. Look, I try to. This is part of what I talk about in the book is like recognizing, like when we go back and we say, oh, I regret not doing that. Given what I know about the world right now, I should have done that, but we don't know that at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
That being said, and this is super silly, or maybe not silly for some people, it's actually super serious. I would say my biggest regret is not going to a Grateful Dead concert.
That's a great answer.
So many times I was like, oh, I'll see them. Like I was like, people were always going to Oakland in the Bay Area, and I was like, I wasn't like a total deadhead, but I'd always be like, oh, like whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've been to Bernie, I've done all the things, I've done everything, right? I'll do everything, but I kept saying like mañana, like later, and then Jerry died, and so I know there's parts of them are still traveling, but like it's just a regret. I would have loved to see the Dead live.
Totally, no, that's a valid regret. I hear you. And what's the one thing you wish to pass down to the next generation?
Oh gosh. Well, no surprise. The one thing I want to pass down to the next generation is to think and act in a way in regard to the next generation, right? I mean, like literally, even if you listen to this and you don't buy the book and you just see it on the newsstand as you're walking by, this idea of becoming a great ancestor, that you are not the end of history. You are at just the very beginning. You are page one, and what you do, not just in terms of how you vote or how you consume, but literally in relation, how you are. And by the way, when I say in relation to yourself, your internal dialogue, the intra-dialogue, the intra-relation, and how you are in relation to other human beings and those around you and those you barely even know, that actually matters. I can't tell you how many people I meet who are doing great things in the world, but aren't very nice. And they're not nice to their partners or their spouses, or their children don't even know them, but they're inventing tomorrow. Like, doesn't matter. That does not matter. Like it starts in those relationships. And from there you can go on and do great things. But if you're not doing that, first and foremost, what I want to pass on is like, that's what matters. You don't have to be a Nobel laureate. You just have to be a good human being.
Yeah. I'm with you. You got to do well. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So fun to see you and to talk to you.
Yeah, and folks
I feel like it's been a minute, and I'm glad we did this.
It's been more than a minute. But I'm sure with me talking, folks can go to longpath.org, sign up for the newsletter. We're starting to do Long Path Gathers again, where we bring folks together in different cities around the country and the world. And obviously, if you're going to buy the book, shop local. If not, go online. But thank you either way.
Awesome. Thanks for tuning in to Dialogue's 10 by 20 interview series, where we ask 10 questions in 20 minutes to profile international leaders working at the intersection of people, technology, and society. That's all for today's episode. Like and subscribe below to get notified for our upcoming interviews. Follow us on Instagram at dialogue_co.